Let's talk about leadership and change management in this video. Change management needs to happen in organizations when increased pressures for change come from the external environment. But why do we need to tame change management? Why does that matter? Well, it is because, according to CIPD, less than 60% of change initiatives meet their stated objectives. So a 40% failure rate, even considering that many people in management will exaggerate the extent to which the stated objectives have been met. So it could well be more than 40% failure in reality. Such a high percentage of failure cannot be ignored. Failure to do so results in loss of market position, removal of senior management, loss of credibility amongst the stakeholders, loss of key employees, reduction in employee engagement, and so on. Organizational issues in change management processes include failure to consider linkages between strategy, structure, and systems. So in other words, we change one of the three, but not change the others accordingly, leading to a misalignment between the three. Lack of effective project management. So for example, insufficient training that would enable employees to embrace that change. Poor communication and lack of relevant information, preventing employees from buying into the reasons for change. Over-managing change, that is way too much energy spent on managing it and not enough on enacting it. So in other words, a lot of energy spent on information about it, but not enough spent on the infrastructure that would make it happen. And finally, lack of effective leadership. And sometimes this last one underpins all of the others, because it is up to leadership or up to good leadership or up to management that also encompasses good leadership to consider linkages between strategy, structure, and systems, to effectively project manage and offer people, for example, sufficient training, although this is not the only vulnerable point in project management, the ability to communicate the change clearly and enable employees to buy into it, and managing that change effectively. All this can be done by management that shows good leadership skills. There is considerable resistance to change in organizations, and it's important to learn about these points of resistance in order to understand how they can be overcome. Types of resistance include, for example, technical resistance, unwillingness to change procedures. So when we say technical, we don't necessarily mean IT. We don't mean that we're used to this software, so why change it? But also procedures, guidelines, algorithms, ways of doing things. Changing those can be met with technical resistance. Political resistance, when change threatens powerful stakeholders, for example, a particular faction of staff or a particular hierarchical level of staff. Cultural resistance, norms of behavior and values that support the status quo. Think, for example, changing from offices to open plan offices. There would be a considerable cultural resistance to such a change. Not sure if that would also apply to a change that goes from open plan to closed offices, but definitely the first one would be resisted on grounds of cultural resistance. Then people resist the content of a change, so not believing in the need for that specific change, as well as to the process of change. So the way in which it is introduced, the way in which it is managed. A typical complaint for the process of change is that it came without prior consultation of employees. So this is a crucial step for leadership to take into account before any change. What causes people to resist change? What causes the resistance that we so neatly put into those types we mentioned before? One would be a misunderstanding of the need for change or misunderstanding of the change itself, possibly due to lack of trust in the agents of change. It could also be due to incorrect information, resulting in uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes increased perception of threat. Another possible reason could be parochial self-interest. People will have invested into their status, their position into the organization, in the organization, and a change could threaten that. Contradictory assessments could be another reason for resistance. So, where the reason for change and the associated opportunities and threats that that change entail will differ among employees. In a good organizational culture, this is not always detrimental. On the contrary, diversity can lead to constructive criticism and durable change, therefore success of that planned change. In a toxic organizational culture, this is definitely detrimental. Finally, low tolerance for change. Even when everything is done well and even when the information is reliable, trustworthy, and not too controversial, employees differ in their ability to cope with the uncertainty that change brings with it. Some will fear not being able to develop the new skills, behavior, not being able to perform to the level entailed by this change. Not necessarily not being able to do things well or better, but not being able to adapt to change. Let me walk you through an example that's pretty close to home. Change to online learning and teaching in universities. I'm sure you'll have a similar story to tell from a student's perspective. But let me tell you what the organizational perspective is in many of UK universities. And I've extracted that not just from my personal experience as a member of staff in one of these universities, but as an observer on social media platforms where I interact with a lot of academics that reacted in various ways to a pretty consistent direction of change throughout the sector, particularly this year and last year. Whether or not this is durable, we can't yet tell. So the pandemic hit and we needed to change the ways we did things. We needed to change it for the previous academic year, but also in a more planned, organized fashion for this academic year. So to start with, there were some misunderstanding of the reasons for change. Some people thought perhaps that the pandemic wouldn't last, therefore there would be no need to implement a long-lasting change. And some colleagues, not necessarily in this university, lacked trust in the leaders of higher education institutions, being perhaps suspicious that they would use the opportunity to make a change that staff doesn't normally welcome towards online learning and teaching. So that would be an example of misunderstanding and lack of trust as a source of resistance. Another example would be to do with parochial self-interest. People invested their whole careers into learning to teach effectively in class, face to face. So changing that would change the status quo and would change the skill set required to do this job well. People who do well already don't particularly or are likely to not necessarily welcome a change in that skill set required. Contradictory assessment, an example of that is a disagreement about opportunities and threats that come from the change. Some worry that the change to online learning and teaching would be permanent. Others worry that others welcome the opportunity for more online learning and teaching than we did before. But as far as I'm aware, no one wishes to do as much online learning and teaching as we have to do just now. but many of us see it as a way to explore doing a bit of both, a bit of online and a bit of face-to-face. But the combination of the two is still contested, and we still don't have an agreement as to what's best, or what's best for our university even. There are universities that did well with a business plan focused on online learning and teaching. Ours is not one of those universities. So what is the best way forward for University of Glasgow and universities like ours? Finally, low tolerance for change. Regardless of whether or not there is a good reason to oppose it, some people just feel threatened and feel great anxiety coming with the uncertainty surrounding this change. Even if they understand the reason for change, that anxiety is unescapable for some. And indeed, you've seen in those cultural dimensions, typologies, either House through Globe project or any other, there is a dimension to do with uncertainty and tolerance for uncertainty. So people differ there, both individually but also culturally as nations. Now, leadership plays a role in managing change. Leaders play a role in that because they excel at navigating the unknown. They excel because they do better at navigating the unknown than management does. Management can only navigate organizational situations for which they have a set of rules, regulations, and rewards package available. In times of change, all those change as well. Therefore, leadership is more effective on such moving sands. How can leadership help with change management? First, through education and communication. They could help by communicating clearly the rationale for change, making sure not to misrepresent the benefits of change, as doing so would trigger a lack of trust once those benefits don't materialize. The downside of this strategy involves perhaps expensive training programs, significant time and effort, face-to-face counseling, a lot of meetings, memos, reports, so a significant amount of effort. Another way through which leaders could make a difference through change is through participation and involvement, involving those that the change will affect in the planning and implementation process, typically through what we call consultation. This is a good strategy because it creates a sense of contribution and control. And you will probably guess that certain leadership styles will do better with this strategy than others. So team-based leadership and participative leadership is likely to yield best results with this particular strategy. It can only be used when employees have the knowledge, ability, and willingness to contribute effectively. So perhaps it cannot be used on its own, but rather in tandem with the previous strategy, education and communication. Facilitation and support is another strategy leaders could use to manage resistance to change. It develops awareness for the need for change and self-awareness of the main actors or even implementers of the change, of the feelings they hold towards the unknown. It involves informal support from line managers, so some buy-in from the line managers, as well as formal interventions like job rotation, time off, etc. It is especially useful when changes trigger anxiety and fear, but it can be, like the others, time-consuming and expensive and may not completely alleviate employee concerns. The fourth strategy leaders as change agents could adopt is negotiation and agreement, offering incentives to active or potential resistors. This is where our understanding of rewards and motivation can be helpful. If navigating through change is a challenge, then offering rewards and motivators to accompany any change management planning makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And this is particularly appropriate with stakeholders that have significant capacity to block that change. It is also appropriate when stakeholders are likely to be negatively affected by change. It can be effective, but potentially expensive. There you go. None of these strategies are cheap or not time consuming. But this one has an additional downside. It creates a precedent for future changes, which may also need to be negotiated in similar terms. Political approaches to managing change often include two strategies of manipulation and co-optation. Manipulation consists of changing perceptions and behaviors of others through selective use and presentation of information. So perhaps offering over-optimistic scenarios. Co-optation consists of giving key resistors a role in the design and implementation of change to gain their endorsement of change. They both are a form of manipulation, and therefore they can backfire if actors feel that they're tricked or used. Not to mention that co-opted colleagues may continue to create problems and pretty much act as double agents. How do different cultures deal with change? Again, with reference to cultural dimensions in various typologies, including globe, some cultures are more comfortable with change than others. Cultural characteristics helping us understand resistance to change are uncertainty avoidance, fatalism, past versus future orientation, and power distance. This slide offers a useful example from ICANN and colleagues 2014 about Chinese organization structure. Remaining hierarchical, remaining family-like, and the leader being seen as a father or a father figure in spite of business requirements for decentralization structures. Now, even though there are plenty of reasons to resist change and a number of cultural dimensions that indicate a different appetite for change from different cultures, global competition dictates a general international trend towards openness to change. Indeed, change is something that we are becoming more and more used to, regardless of the culture we come from. There is also a general trend towards employee involvement and empowerment in processes of change, high interdependence, therefore reliance on trust, team, quality, innovation, performance orientation, and a focus on diversity and inclusion that comes with management of change. So focus on those who can be potentially left behind and which would be inhumane, but also could cause problems to the organization further down the line. Leadership plays a key role in particularly uncertainty avoidant societies, explaining why change is necessary, where the organization is heading, what can be expected, really that voice of reassurance. But leadership cannot do this alone. It needs HR practices, so human resources practices. And modern human resources practices support change agents by selection processes, so recruiting individuals willing to innovate, performance appraisal, including evaluation criteria such as teamwork, innovation, participation, and so on, and specific training and development programs focusing on developing change agents, communication skills, facilitation skills, etc. You will notice that I'm using the concept of change agents in relation to leaders, but also in relation to followers. And you will remember the previous video where we made the point that leadership could come from anywhere within the organization.